They offered him 15 brides, 15 polished photographs of smiling women from back east, and he stunned the entire agency when he pushed them aside and said, "Give me the woman no one wanted." A choice that would test his courage, break his heart, and change the meaning of love on the unforgiving frontier forever. In the sun-scorched plains of 1889 Arizona Territory, where the desert wind howled like a restless spirit and the mountains stood jagged against endless blue sky, lived a cattleman named Boone Carter, a man forged by dust storms, cattle drives, and a loneliness so deep it echoed louder than a canyon shout. Boone was not a man given to softness. His broad shoulders carried the weight of 1,000 dawns spent riding fence lines. His hands were cracked like dry riverbeds from years gripping reins and branding irons, and his gray-green eyes held the faraway look of someone who had buried more than he cared to speak of, including a mother lost to fever when he was 14 and a younger brother taken by a rattlesnake bite the following summer. Tragedies that left him the sole heir to a modest but struggling ranch outside the rough-edged town of Copper Ridge. For years he convinced himself he needed nothing more than his horse, Bandit, and the steady rhythm of work, but nights were merciless on the frontier, stretching long and hollow beneath star-heavy skies. And when he found himself lingering in town longer than necessary, just to hear the murmur of voices through the saloon doors, he knew solitude had begun to gnaw at him like a coyote at bone. That was when he saw the advertisement nailed crookedly beside the general store, "Respectable ladies seeking marriage in the Western Territories." And after 3 evenings of silent debate, Boone rode into town, dust trailing behind him, and met with the agency representative, a sharp-dressed man named Mr. Clarence Whitaker, whose hair was slicked back with oil and whose city suit looked painfully out of place among hitching posts and spurs. Whitaker laid out 15 photographs on a small wooden desk inside the telegraph office, each picture carefully labeled in neat ink. Margaret from Savannah, skilled in piano and etiquette. Lillian from New York, educated and refined. Dorothy from St. Louis, praised for her baking and delicate beauty. And on through 15 hopeful faces framed by lace collars and careful smiles. Women who looked as though they had stepped from parlor rooms into a dream of frontier romance. Any one of these ladies would consider herself fortunate, Mr. Carter, Whitaker said smoothly, tapping the stack with manicured fingers. But Boone barely glanced at them, because something inside him tightened, a memory of standing unwanted at the edge of other people's choices, of being passed over for ranch partnerships, of watching townsfolk steer their daughters away from the rough orphaned boy who smelled of horses and hardship. And after a long, heavy silence, Boone lifted his gaze and asked quietly, "Is that all of them?" Whitaker smiled politely. "The finest candidates." Boone's jaw shifted. "No, I mean the one nobody picked." The representative's composure flickered, just slightly, before he cleared his throat and reached into his leather case, pulling out a thinner envelope marked in small red letters, "Unclaimed." Inside was a single photograph, creased at the edges, of a woman named Abigail Turner, 27 years old, a schoolteacher from Cincinnati, widowed 2 years prior in a factory accident, bearing a faint but visible burn scar along her right temple from a childhood house fire, and mother to a 5-year-old son described in the attached note as frail in constitution, prone to persistent coughing, rejected 14 times by prospective husbands who sought a wife unburdened by a child and unmarred by imperfection. Boone studied the image for a long moment, seeing beyond the scar and the solemn expression to the exhaustion in her eyes, an exhaustion he recognized because he carried it himself, and he felt something shift in his chest, not pity but kinship, the understanding of what it meant to be measured and found lacking by those who never bothered to look deeper. "I'll take her," he said, his voice steady as a rifle shot. Whitaker blinked in disbelief. "Sir, you haven't considered." "I have," Boone cut in, placing his calloused hand over the photograph as if shielding it. "Send for her." The weeks that followed dragged like a slow cattle drive through mud. Boone preparing his modest ranch house with a focus that bordered on desperation, mending the sagging fence, whitewashing the small bedroom, building a narrow bed for the boy from pine he cut himself in the hills, and scrubbing years of bachelor dust from the wooden floors until his back ached, all the while battling doubts that crept in during quiet hours. Would she see him as too rough, too silent, too shaped by loss to be gentle? Would the boy fear him? Would she regret stepping into a land so vast it could swallow a person whole? Finally, beneath a blazing September sun, the stagecoach rattled into Copper Ridge, wheels grinding against stone, and Boone stood beside the depot in his cleanest shirt, hat clutched tight enough to crease the brim, heart pounding harder than it ever had in a stampede. The door creaked open, and Abigail Turner stepped down carefully, her simple traveling dress dusted from the journey, her burn scar visible beneath the edge of her bonnet, and in her arms she held a small boy with pale cheeks and wide, uncertain eyes who coughed softly into a handkerchief as if the dry air itself startled him. The townsfolk watched openly, some whispering, some shaking their heads at the sight of Boone Carter choosing what they assumed was less than he could have had, but Boone saw none of that. He saw only the way Abigail straightened her shoulders as if bracing for disappointment, and when their eyes met, he tipped his hat and said in a voice rough but sincere, "Ma'am, welcome to Arizona." And in that single moment, as desert wind curled around them, and the future stretched wide and unknown, a story began that neither of them yet understood would demand sacrifice, courage, and a love fierce enough to defy every rejection that had ever tried to define them. The first winter tested every fragile thread binding them together. Abigail Turner had braced herself for hardship when she agreed to marry a stranger in Arizona territory, but the desert cold was a different kind of cruel, slipping through cracks in the cabin walls and settling into her bones long after the sun disappeared behind the mesas. Boone Carter worked relentlessly from sunrise to moonlight, mending fences, bargaining for feed, and stretching every dollar thin as wire, determined to prove that choosing her had not been an act of foolish sentiment, but of conviction. Inside the small ranch house, Abigail traded schoolbooks for washboards and sewing needles for saddle repairs, her scar no longer hidden beneath lace veils, but visible in the honest glow of firelight, while little Henry's cough echoed through the nights, each rasping breath a reminder that the West could heal or harm with equal indifference. Town gossip traveled quickly, and more than once Boone caught whispers in Copper Ridge about how he could have chosen prettier, simpler, easier, yet he answered none of it with words. Instead, he answered with action, riding through bitter wind to fetch medicine when Henry's fever spiked, trading 2 healthy calves without hesitation to pay the doctor, and sitting quietly beside the boy's bed through the longest hours of darkness. Abigail saw then what she had not fully understood before. Boone did not love loudly, but he loved fiercely, with sacrifice instead of speeches. Slowly, Henry's strength began to return under the wide, dry sky, his laughter tentative at first, then freer as Boone led him on a gentle horse through the pasture, telling stories of hawks and brave cowboys who never quit. For the first time since arriving, Abigail allowed herself to imagine a future instead of simply surviving the present. But peace on the frontier was never permanent. Rustlers cut through Boone's north fence one night, stealing cattle and leaving trouble in their wake, and Boone returned from tracking them with a knife wound across his shoulder, blood soaking through his shirt. As Abigail stitched him by lamplight, fear tightening her chest, Boone finally voiced the doubt he had carried in silence. "You could have had comfort back east," he murmured. Abigail met his eyes, steady despite the tremble in her hands. Comfort isn't the same as belonging. In that quiet exchange, something shifted fully into place between them, not born of convenience or desperation, but of shared risk and chosen loyalty. Outside, winter loosened its grip and the first stubborn signs of spring pushed through the dust, and though debts lingered and danger still rode the edges of their land, the Carter Ranch no longer felt like a lonely outpost at the end of the world. It felt like the beginning of something neither rejection nor hardship could easily undo. A marriage forged not from perfection, but from 2 people who had both known what it meant to be overlooked and who now refused to let each other stand alone. Again, by the time the second spring rolled across Arizona territory, brushing the desert floor with stubborn wildflowers and softening the harsh edges of Copper Ridge, Boone Carter understood something he had never known in all his solitary years. A man could build fences, break horses, and survive gunfire, but it took far greater strength to build a family. The ranch was not rich, not by any banker's measure, yet it stood steadier than it had before Abigail Turner ever stepped down from that stagecoach, And the difference was not in the cattle count or the repaired barn roof. It was in the warmth that greeted Boone each evening when he rode home beneath a sky streaked in gold. Henry's health, once so fragile it seemed the desert wind might carry him away, had grown stronger with each passing month. The cough that once haunted their nights faded into rare spells, and the boy who had clung shyly to his mother's skirts now raced across open pasture with dust at his heels, calling Boone Pa, without hesitation. A single word that struck deeper than any brand on Boone's skin. Abigail, too, had changed, not by losing the scar along her temple or erasing the grief of her past, but by standing straighter in the face of it. She no longer flinched beneath curious stares in town, and when other ranch wives asked how she had come west, she answered without shame, her voice calm and sure, as if the choice had always been destiny rather than desperation. Yet the true test of what they had built came the night a wildfire sparked in the dry hills north of their property, flames licking hungrily across brittle grass under a wind that carried embers like scattered stars, and word spread fast that several ranches lay directly in its path. Boone could have guarded only his own land, could have chosen safety over risk, but he saddled his horse and rode toward the smoke, organizing bucket lines and helping neighbors drive cattle to safer ground, while Abigail rallied the women and older children to haul water and wet down the edges of their pasture, her scar glistening with sweat, but her expression fierce with resolve. Through choking smoke and blistering heat, they fought side by side with the rest of Copper Ridge until dawn finally broke and the fire's fury weakened, leaving blackened earth but spared homes. In the quiet aftermath, as ash drifted like gray snow, the same townsfolk who once whispered about Boone's choice looked at Abigail differently, not as the unwanted widow with a sickly child, but as the woman who had stood unflinching when it mattered most. That evening, exhausted and streaked with soot, Boone found Abigail sitting on the porch steps watching Henry sleep through the open window, and without ceremony or grand speech, he knelt in the dust before her, pulling from his pocket a simple band he had fashioned from melted silver coins saved over the past year. "I chose you because I knew what it felt like to be passed over," he said quietly, voice rough with emotion. "But I love you because you're the strongest person I've ever known." Tears welled in Abigail's eyes, not the tears of fear she had shed in lonely Eastern nights, but of certainty, and she placed her hand in his, accepting not just the ring but the life they had forged through doubt, illness, gossip, and flame. Their wedding was small, held beneath the wide desert sky, with Henry standing proudly between them. And though there were no grand decorations or city luxuries, there was something far rarer, a room, or rather a horizon, full of witnesses who understood that love on the frontier was not about perfection but perseverance. Years later, when the ranch expanded and laughter echoed through rooms once filled with silence, and when another child, a daughter with Abigail's steady eyes, toddled across the same porch where Boone had once stood alone, he would often think back to that day in the telegraph office when 15 smiling faces had been placed before him and he had asked for the one no one wanted. He would remember the doubt in the agent's eyes, the whispers in town, the risks that seemed almost reckless at the time, and he would look at the life surrounding him, at Henry strong and tall, at Abigail radiant not despite her scars but because of them, and know with unshakable certainty that the world had been wrong. She had never been unwanted. She had simply been waiting for someone who could see her worth beyond the surface, someone who understood that the most enduring love stories are not built on flawless beginnings, but on brave choices. And in the quiet glow of many desert sunsets, as Boone wrapped an arm around his wife and listened to the wind move gently through the cottonwoods, he would whisper a silent gratitude for the moment he had pushed aside 15 perfect photographs and chosen instead the imperfect, extraordinary woman who had turned his lonely stretch of dust into a home.